Hi there, everyone. Greetings from Tel Aviv. This is Judy Maltz, Haaretz correspondent. I think we probably need to start by pointing out that the Arab-led Joint List, which holds 15 of the 120 seats in the Knesset, has no representation in the World Zionist Congress, so it will not be part of this review. I'll start with Likud. The Likud has for a long time been the biggest party in Israel, and with the exception of a few years in the 90s, has been in power or sharing power with another big party ever since 1977. It's best to think of it as the American equivalent of the Republican Party. It tends to be hardline politically, resistant to the idea of territorial compromise, although Netanyahu, the longtime party leader, did once say he supported a two-state solution. On economics, it tends to favor free market policy and is very hostile to the notion of socialism. The Likud today, though, is very different from the original Likud of Menachem Begin, who brought the party to power in 1977. The original Likud emerged out of the party known as Cherut, founded by followers of Zev Jabotinsky. Right now, it is really hard to say what the ideology of Likud voters is, besides pretty much unconditional support for Prime Minister Netanyahu. Many of those once considered pillars of the party, people like Benny Begin, the son of the former prime minister, have said out loud that they can no longer vote for it. The party hardly gets any support anymore from those who were once considered to be its main base, the Ashkenazi bourgeois class. Perhaps the only representative of that group still left in the party is Ruvi Rivlin, who's today Israel's president. The Likud receives most of its votes today from working class Mizrahim, that is, Jews of Middle Eastern and North African origin. They tend to live outside the big cities and still harbor a lot of resentment toward the Ashkenazi elites. The reason goes back many years to the time their parents and grandparents arrived in Israel in the 50s and 60s and weren't always treated nicely by the old-timers. Begin, by the way, was able to leverage this resentment to his benefit in 1977, as has Netanyahu, perhaps even to greater effect. Let's move on here now to the second biggest party in the current Knesset, Blue and White, otherwise known as Kahol Lavan. Blue and White is a relatively new party and the major partner of Likud in this government. It was formed as a merger between three smaller factions: Chosen Yisrael, or Resilience for Israel, which was a faction or party founded by Benny Gantz, the former Army Chief of Staff. Yesh Atid, a party that has been around for 8 years and founded by Yair Lapid, and Telem, a very small party founded by Moshe Ya'alon, the former Chief of Staff and Defense Minister. After the March 3rd election, Blue and White split up over disagreement about whether or not to join Netanyahu's government. Gantz took the Chosen Yisrael people with him to the government and kept the Blue and White name, while Yesh Atid and Telem went to the opposition. Blue and White received many of its votes from people who in past years would have voted for the Labor Party. It is not much different from Likud on economic issues, but on politics, even though its leaders have tended to say as little as possible about where they stand on the conflict, there tends to be a belief among Israelis that they favor a two-state solution and are more willing to make territorial compromises than Likud. A major difference with Likud, at least one reflected in its official platform, is on matters of religion and state. Blue and White is much more open to religious freedom and religious pluralism. It has expressed support for civil marriage, for public transportation on Shabbat, and on more than one occasion, Benny Gantz has spoken about his support for the famous Kotel deal, which would have granted equal status and full recognition to the non-Orthodox movements at the Western Wall. Yesh Atid, which I just mentioned and is now in opposition, is a centrist party, best known for its very secular agenda. Lapid's big issue, in fact, when the party was launched, was getting the ultra-Orthodox to perform military service and reducing the number of ultra-Orthodox men who got paid by the state to sit in yeshivas and learn. This explains why, until now, Yesh Atid and the ultra-Orthodox have never sat in a coalition government together. The anti-religious slant of the party was somewhat tempered during its year-long alliance with Gantz. Most of its voters are secular, middle class, and upper middle class Israelis who, in general, detest Netanyahu. On economics, the party tends to be very capitalist in orientation, and on religion and state matters, very progressive. Let's move on to Yisrael Beitenu, which is also in the opposition now for the first time. This is a party that was founded by Avigdor Lieberman, once a very close associate of Netanyahu's. In the past, it targeted Russian-speaking voters almost exclusively. In recent elections, it has started to span out more. It tends to be hardline politically, although Lieberman has expressed support for a two-state solution. Because of its Russian-speaking base, it is also a very secular party. Let's not forget that a large share of the Russian-speaking population in Israel, about 400,000 people, are not considered halachically Jewish by the state. Lieberman was able to attract a lot of voters outside his base in the recent elections because of his very fierce stance against religious coercion. Probably the main difference between his party and Yesh Atid today is that his is more hardline politically. Because of various remarks he has made in the past, it's also considered to be somewhat racist, an anti-Arab party. Let's move on to Yamina. Yamina is the latest incarnation of what was once the National Religious Party, best known as the Mafdal. It is the party most blatantly aligned with the settler movement in Israel, and its base is what would in the United States be the equivalent of the modern Orthodox community. By the way, Yamina has been doing phenomenally well in the polls recently, and that has nothing to do with its position on the settlements and everything to do with the ongoing attacks by its chairman, Naftali Bennett, against the government for mishandling the coronavirus crisis. Incidentally, Yamina is also in the opposition now. Let's move on to the ultra-Orthodox parties now. First, Shas. Shas is the ultra-Orthodox Mizrahi party, and all of its Knesset members are ultra-Orthodox. Like its Ashkenazi counterpart, which is known as Yahadut HaTorah today, it does not allow for women on its list. But unlike the case with Yahadut HaTorah, its voters are not all ultra-Orthodox. Shas enjoys a lot of support among working-class Mizrahi Jews who tend to be traditional. It once sat in the same government as Yitzhak Rabin when he headed the Labor Party, and back then, its leaders even supported the two-state solution. Today, the party is very right-wing on political issues, more right-wing, in fact, than the Likud. Yahadut HaTorah, as I mentioned, is the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi party. Like Shas, it has been part of the right-wing bloc headed by Likud for many years now. In exchange for its support for Netanyahu and his party, Yahadut HaTorah is able to guarantee that its boys are not drafted into the army and that yeshiva bachers continue to get their government stipends for studying in yeshivas. Even more important is in exchange for its support, Yahadut HaTorah knows that Netanyahu will never grant full recognition to the non-Orthodox movements in Israel, and that is absolutely critical for them. Remember the Kotel deal I mentioned before? Well, the reason Netanyahu canceled it in the end was because of threats from his ultra-Orthodox coalition party partners that they would pull out of the government if he went ahead with it. There was a time many years ago when ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi parties were considered to be dovish politically. But ever since they've joined forces with Netanyahu, they pretty much go along with everything he wants that is outside the realm of religion and state. Labor Party is the party that built Israel and ruled the country for its first 3 decades, but it is basically dead right now. It has 3 seats in the current Knesset, and if elections were held today, according to every single poll, it wouldn't get in. Two of its three members joined Netanyahu's government and got ministerial positions in exchange. It is probably, in its heyday, it was the Social Democratic Party. And finally, the Democratic camp. The Democratic camp is the latest incarnation of Meretz. It is also a very tiny party right now, and it is the most left-wing of the Zionist parties. It is the only Jewish party not afraid to say it opposes the occupation, champions civil rights, supports Jewish pluralism, civil marriage, and gay marriage. In fact, the current leader of the party, Nitzan Horowitz, is openly gay. Unlike Labor, though, if elections were held today, according to every single poll, the Democratic camp or Meretz or whatever you want to call it would get in, and it would probably bring with it a lot of old Labor Party voters. I want to wish you all lots of luck and success in the upcoming Congress, and thanks for hearing me today.